Any season of renewal needs to begin with a study of the church and its purpose for the world. The great ends of the church are a great place to start. And the first great end is the proclamation of the gospel for the salvation of humankind.
Few Presbyterians want to be called a Jesus freak. Even worse would be to be called a Presbyterian Jesus freak. Isn't that a contradiction in terms?
Likewise, no one wants to be called a Christian hypocrite. As Presbyterians, we tend to recoil at the disparity we too often see between profession and confession.
And let's be honest, even Presbyterians don't believe evangelism is best done by committee.
Paul wrote to the Corinthians, "We have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God. We are the jars of clay. To God belongs the extraordinary power." How do we share the good news of what God has done and is doing in Jesus Christ with extraordinary power? The first great end of the church is the proclamation of the gospel for the salvation of humankind, which is visually depicted in the image to the left. In this image, the book represents the scriptures. The dove is rising from the scriptures, indicating the source of both the original witness and our present understanding. The same spirit that inspired the original writers enables us to receive the gospel. The cross behind the book and dove reminds us that the heart of the gospel of Jesus Christ is God with us and God for us. This first great end raises several questions. What does it mean to proclaim? What is the gospel? What is salvation? Does your congregation have a common, consistent definition for these terms? St. Francis of Assisi said, "Preach the gospel always, and, if necessary, use words." While most Presbyterians love St. Francis and agree with him on the need to live one's faith, to walk the walk and not just talk the talk, is it appropriate to use his quote to recuse oneself and one's congregation from the obedience to speak the gospel message? What is to distinguish a Presbyterian from a committed supporter of the United Way? Congregations sometimes assume all their members agree about the content of the gospel. The Greek word for gospel is euangelion, which literally translates as good news. But what news? Is the news merely a reductionist version of Christian faith, such as the four spiritual laws? Or is it more expansive, inclusive of God's call to Abraham and Sarah, the story of the law and the prophets, the full life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, as well as the promised hope of new creation? What is the story your congregation shares with the world? A congregation must define salvation. Is salvation limited to the afterlife? Or is there a sense that salvation is intended also for earth as it is in heaven? Is it motivated by fear or amazing grace? Is salvation limited to those who believe a certain dogma or practice particular rituals or live a lifestyle that conforms to a certain set of standards? How does your church express the reality that in Christ God reconciled God's self to humanity, creating a new humanity, and invites a deepening intimacy with our Creator? It is necessary to focus special attention on the verb in the first great end of the church, proclaim. With apologies to St. Francis, there is a story to tell to the nations. The first great end, therefore, invites us to practice evangelism intentionally, yet authentically. Healthy congregations move people, even Presbyterians, beyond a fear of evangelism that has been formed by caricatures of the street corner preacher. Healthy congregations create an ethos of being relational, invitational, and missional. What does it look like to practice relational, invitational, and missional evangelism? Thrive Handbook lists 10 behaviors. Here are 3. Invites a friend to church to hear the gospel. Has conversations about God or faith with people outside of the church. Acts with a genuine love of people clearly shown, then invites someone to faith, rather than invite someone to faith before doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly with God. Alongside the life of the individual Jesus follower stands a congregation. The Thrive Handbook lists 10 ways a congregation can practice relational, invitational, and missional evangelism. Here are 3. Wrestles with the meaning of salvation and has a clearly defined, wide consensus definition of salvation that is understood and regularly articulated within the congregation, encourages and trains their members in how to share their faith story with others, and is ready when those without faith, those seeking faith, and those of fragile faith come to worship or another church event. Such a congregation has trained their members how to invite people into a vibrant new way of living. Most Presbyterian churches will wrestle with cultivating the above values. Indeed, this may be the most difficult of the 6 great ends for a Presbyterian church to practice. This wrestling is not with the angels, however, but with our own demons of memory, embarrassment, and mortification that have come from evangelistic encounters that were focused on harsh judgmentalism. Too seldom have we experienced faith sharing born of love, filled with wonder, that invites us to notice the Spirit at work among us. Some may suggest that growing in healthy evangelism is not necessary in order for the Presbyterian Church to discover God's revitalization. I respectfully suggest that the Scriptures, especially the New Testament, disagree. Here's an invitation to prayer. If you resist healthy evangelism, how interested are you really in revitalization?